Now going to get started. Welcome. This is Laura Podolsky with the UC Institute of Transportation Studies. We are absolutely delighted you joined us for today's webinar, Insights into Why and How Cities Are Planning for Autonomous Vehicles. This webinar is the first of many more webinars to be organized by the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, or UCITS for short. The UCITS is a network of faculty, research, and administrative staff and students dedicated to advancing the state of the art in transportation engineering, planning, and policy for the people of California. Established by the California legislature in 1947, the UCITS has branches at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Irvine, and UCLA. The new research you'll be hearing about today was made possible through funding received by the state of California via the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017. So before we begin, I want to go over just a couple logistics. So our time today, we've organized it so it'll be equally split between a presentation, and then the second half will be for a discussion and Q&A with all of you. So if you do have questions, please make note of those. We will be handling questions at the end of the presentation. Everyone is going to be muted on this webinar, so if you do have a question, type it into the chat box. And if you have a question on a specific slide, be sure to note the slide number or title. This webinar is being recorded, and so a link to that webinar recording will be provided afterwards, along with the presentation slides and the associated report and policy brief. So look in your email, because we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our speakers. We have Professor Dan Chatman, who is an Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley. He studies travel behavior in the built environment, residential and workplace location choice, smart growth and municipal finance decision-making, and the connections between public transportation, immigration, and economic growth of cities. We're also joined by Marcel Moran, who is a PhD student at the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley. He studies innovations in urban mobility, including autonomous vehicles and bike and scooter sharing systems. He also holds degrees from Harvard and the University of Chicago. So we're very excited today, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan and Marcel. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laura, for that introduction. Much appreciated. And how we're going to handle this is Marcel and I are going to do a little bit of tag team. So I'll start, and we have a couple different sections of the report that we're presenting here. So thanks to everyone who's joining us. We have quite a few people on the line. And again, encourage you to, as you have questions as they come up, to please type them up in the chat box, and Laura is going to help us moderate the questions. And we're going to try to get this done by about 12:30, so that we have lots of time for questions at the end, and we'll be finished by noon Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern. So where do we begin? People who are on this call are aware about the presence and the testing that's going on with autonomous vehicles in the United States. It's something that's happening across the country in a growing number of US states and cities. And what we're focused on in this particular research project is not the state or federal level, but the municipal, local, and regional level of how municipalities and transit agencies and regions are going to respond, both to pilot testing that's going on, as well as the expectation that autonomous vehicles may make up a growing share of travel in the future, and what ought to be done in terms of plans and policies. Now, predictions as to the short and the long-term effects of autonomous vehicles vary quite a bit. There's been a lot of claims about how autonomous vehicles will reduce crashes and the related fatalities, how they may improve mobility options for persons with disabilities, how they could also increase congestion and decrease ridership on transit. So there's a big wide range of possible autonomous vehicle scenarios, and this presents obvious challenges for planning at the local and regional and agency level. And I want to point out, for the purpose of this presentation, that our report is focused on a set of issues over which municipalities and local and regional agencies have some measure of autonomy. or of control. And we don't focus quite so much on issues around safety or issues about how labor will be affected by the advent of autonomous vehicles. And this is largely because of the fact of state preemption, which is something that Marcel will bring up in his portion of the talk. And finally, before we move on to the first set of slides, I want to say that the funding for this project came from the Institute for Transportation Studies at UC Berkeley, which is one of the 4 ITS campuses, which Laura just mentioned. And the grant was in part funded by Senate Bill 1, which is California's recent increase in the gasoline tax, which is something that funds transportation improvements across the state, as well as funding research. So, okay, now I'm going to figure out how to advance the slide. There we go. Here's the outline of what we're going to go over today. An introduction, we'll discuss our research methods, and then we'll have 2 main sections of findings. One of them is on autonomous vehicle testing and pilots, and the other one is on longer-term autonomous vehicle policies, followed by a conclusion and then time for questions. So previous research on autonomous vehicles has largely been speculative, and this is in part because the technology has yet to be widely adopted or in fact even widely tested. Reports such as those pictured here have effectively considered a number of different issues, issues around possible adoption rates of autonomous vehicles, various technological questions around autonomous vehicles, issues of safety and claims for safety and projections of safety in travel, possibilities for cities to integrate autonomous vehicles into the urban form of transportation networks, and even some surveys around how and whether municipalities are beginning to include autonomous vehicles in their planning. But what isn't the case for the most part is a focus on what actually cities currently responding to AVs are doing and why they're doing it. And so what we focused on in this project was 2 research questions. The first is, what are cities, regions, and transit agencies doing right now to direct, influence, or react to AV testing and initial passenger pilots within their boundaries? So there's testing going on, and there's also actual passenger services starting to be offered in a few places. And then secondly, to kind of a separate question, what broader policies and plans are cities crafting to respond to the expected advent of autonomous vehicles in the consumer market? So our approach was a bit more qualitative and in-depth than other approaches have been, which have largely been simulation modeling and a couple of wider scale surveys and a few consumer-based surveys about adoption and willingness to use the services once they arrive, but not much done with actually figuring out what cities are doing. So that's what this project is up to. Our research methods were twofold. The first step was a review of documents at the federal, state, and local level regarding autonomous vehicles, just to understand the current regulatory landscape. The image on the far left is the Federal AV START Act, which has not yet been passed, but it's still being considered by the Senate. The middle is a state executive order from Arizona. States have been very heavily involved in playing a role in regulating autonomous vehicles. And in fact, they have preempted the ability of local and regional agencies to do very much, for the most part, with some exceptions that we'll discuss. And the final image there is the landing page for Boston's autonomous vehicle approach, and Boston is one of our case studies. So that's the first part of our research methods. The second part was to choose some cases and conduct interviews with in those cases. So there's a picture there from Arlington, Texas, of a Drive.ai vehicle. That's me and Lindsay Mitchell, who's on the line with us today, and who'll be discussing, I hope, if our technical issues get resolved, a little bit about the Arlington case. That's Marcel in the middle at a reserved passenger pickup sign in a Walmart. Is it Chandler or Phoenix? It's Phoenix, I think. And our cases were the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where we're from, so including San Francisco, San Jose, Palo Alto, and Mountain View, Las Vegas, Phoenix and Chandler in Arizona, Arlington, Texas, Boston, Cambridge, and New York City. We conducted interviews. So our travel was within California, as well as to Nevada, Arizona, New York, Massachusetts, and Texas. We spoke with staff at municipalities, metropolitan planning organizations, transit agencies, state departments of transportation, and with AV firms themselves. And not every single interview that we conducted is represented here because we had a few interviewees who preferred not to be identified, so those were anonymous. But we did interview in cities including Arlington, Texas, Boston, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Chandler, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada. Then we also interviewed people in the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, the Maricopa Association of Governments, which is the Phoenix area MPO, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the Boston area MPO, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is the San Francisco area MPO, Mountain View, California, New York, New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, Palo Alto, California, San Francisco, California, San Jose, California, and Valley Metro in Phoenix, in the Phoenix area, along with a nonprofit organization here in the Bay Area called Spur, and the three companies on the far right there who are autonomous vehicle firms, Nutonomy, Drive.ai, and Cruise. And we had an interview protocol. Here are some sample questions, but I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. And we're going to get to the first set of findings. And Marcel is going to do this part. So handing it over to him.
Okay, hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk through the first part set of our findings, which has to do with AV testing and pilots. I just want to make clear that we want to just use working definitions for these two words. We're referring to testing as the operation of vehicles for the purposes of sensor calibration, building accurate maps, testing the overall performance of onboard computer systems. So that we're referring to testing in that regard. Pilots, we're referring to, our working definition is the initial movement of passenger goods on such vehicles. So I want to make that clear because we're going to be using both of those terms. So the three categories for us and the three vehicle types you'll see on the right here, and this is how we thought to categorize it, was public autonomous shuttles. These tend to be medium capacity, low speed vehicles operating on fixed routes. Private AV passenger services, like you can see in the middle there, it's a collaboration between Lyft and a firm called Aptiv. Those tend to garner the most media attention. And the bottom, we have this range of vehicle types around freight deliveries, including sidewalk robots. Just to begin, it's critical, and Dan mentioned this briefly, it's critical that we recognize the multiple levers of AV policy in the United States that starts at the US DOT. They maintain oversight over design, construction, and performance of motor vehicles. So it's the DOT that provides exemptions to vehicle manufacturers if their vehicles are not going to comply with federal motor vehicle safety standards, such as vehicles without steering wheels. That said, states are left with a wide ability to regulate AVs, and a number of them have preempted municipalities from further regulating them. For instance, Nevada does not allow municipalities to levy any type of tax or fee additional above regular business taxes on AVs. So that leaves cities. Cities are not starting with a blank slate here. They have to grapple with the regulatory environment of their given state, and obviously everyone with the US DOT. So let's get started in terms of pilots. I want to start with Las Vegas. Las Vegas operated a pilot for 12 months. You'll see in the bottom right there. It was a partnership between the city's innovation district, their regional MPO, and the local AAA chapter. The city, via this partnership, was able to be involved in the route design. You can see on the map there, the yellow loop is the shuttle route. They were involved in adjustments to on-street traffic along that route, interactions with signal phasing between the shuttle and light signals, and they were able to evaluate it with surveying riders before and after. Following the completion of this pilot, a larger shuttle route is planned for a nearby medical campus. So we're seeing a fairly tight relationship here between the municipality and the AV pilot. I want to move on to Arlington, Texas, that had two different options. And as Dan mentioned, we have one of our interviewees on the line who we'll hear from near the end of the talk. But the first was a large was a shuttle that navigated across a large sports complex. You can see the image on the top right, similar to the Las Vegas vehicle. That route design was not only managed by the city of Arlington, but actually a city employee served as the onboard vehicle manager, indicating how close a relationship there was there between provider and municipality. Drive AI, you can see in the bottom right, they also operated what was effectively a shuttle around a large office and entertainment complex. Both of these pilots were small in terms of ridership, but the city felt that their citizens are benefiting from being exposed to AVs before larger deployment. This is pretty different from what we saw in San Francisco. So San Francisco in California, where there is state preemption that I'll talk about, there's multiple AV companies, not surprisingly, on city streets. You'll hear beeping in the background. That's on our end. It's a truck in a loading zone. So in San Francisco, the only thing that needs to happen is companies provide cities with instructions on how police should engage with the vehicles if they need to. Importantly, the city cannot influence which roads AVs are tested on, how large these vehicle fleets are, or actually writing these law enforcement guidelines. This is a quote from Tilly Chang, who directs SFCTA, and you can kind of see in the quote venting a bit of frustration regarding the city's inability to even influence what's in that law enforcement plan. There's a lot of California listeners in the audience today. I want to point out the California case is a complicated one where at the state level, there's actually two distinct programs, and this is why we wanted to make that testing and testing versus pilot distinction clear. The DMV in California manages the driverless testing of autonomous vehicles, and there's actually multiple types of permits that operators can apply for. Whereas the CPUC, the Public Utilities Commission, which also has oversight over Uber and Lyft, they manage the autonomous vehicle passenger service pilot program. So there's actually two different agencies involved depending on what stage of AV operation is taking place. I want to move on to Boston. This was also an interesting case for us. Under the Massachusetts framework, all cities were actually granted the ability to opt into AV testing rather than being preempted from doing so. And so what Boston decided to do was create a set of sequential geofences. Firms in Boston have to demonstrate safe operation within each stage before graduating onto the next one. So you can see in the top right, that's a picture of an industrial office park in Boston, which on the map is highlighted in purple. That was the initial place where AV operation where AV testing took place. Based on quarterly reports demonstrating competence, Boston was able to then graduate each firm to the next zone, which is the blue zone, which is a neighborhood called Seaport. And following further documentation of competence in that geofence, the city was able to broaden some firms' ability to test throughout the city. So this is a pretty, autonomy was one that got that ability. This was a really tight working relationship between a municipality and an AV, completely different from the San Francisco context, in part because of the state regulations at play. I want to talk a little bit more about those state regulations with a comparison between Massachusetts and New York. So in New York, deployment of AVs is state controlled by the Registry of Motor Vehicles, RMV, and in particular, the state police are heavily involved in the New York regulations. Under that framework, Governor Cuomo released a press release about the testing of autonomous vehicles in Manhattan in early 2018. However, in response, de Blasio, through a spokesman, voiced concerns around safety, testing, and unproven technology in such a dense area. To date, the testing announced by Cuomo has not taken place in New York City. So we just want to emphasize this, that each city has formal and informal abilities to influence AV testing depending on their state regulations. So even though New York City is effectively preempted at the state level, they still were able to clearly exert some influence over announced testing. I'll just close in terms of talking about goods movement. This is something that we didn't focus on in the report, but is important. We want to note that these vehicles are some of the first ways that many cities are experiencing driverless technology. They range in size from the sidewalk robots on the top here, what we're referring to microcars in the middle, that's from a company called Neuro, to standard size vehicles in the bottom, that's UDELV, which is using a minivan size vehicle to deliver goods, not passengers. Just as an example, San Francisco has kind of gone back and forth with this. There's initial allowing of sidewalk robots with a chaperone. That was then quickly banned over fear of pedestrian altercations in dense parts of San Francisco. And since there is now a new permit that's been awarded to a single company, Postmates, that has street-specific restrictions. So that's something to keep an eye on in terms of future research, because some of these effects may reproduce themselves at the goods level. Just to close here, we really saw across these cases that the publicly led shuttles really provided local agencies, municipalities with the most control over the planning, implementation, and evaluation of these systems and routes and passenger perception. That said, they often service ended without being replaced or clear plans for continuing service. A lot of times this was the case that an initial demonstration grant, which the US DOT provides around AVs, the demonstration grant ended and there was not a plan to continue. Finally, though, the private AV testing is always operating in the context of preemption, which leaves municipalities with less formal channels for influence. And we'll now move on to the second part of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Marcel. So the second part of our report is looking at longer range AV policies. So here we're moving away from just testing and pilots to the question of policy development, anticipating future sort of market penetration of autonomous vehicles. So the outline here is I'll talk a little bit about agency motivations for engaging in some form of planning. And I'll talk about several different policy areas: curb management, smart infrastructure, integration with public transit, development, zoning, and parking, taxes and road user charges, and regional planning. Now, there's lots of different goals and different. Some of these could be described as motivations, but what we're doing is sort of categorizing motivation into three main areas, and those areas are. Some cities have essentially been focused on managing what's happening within their borders, the embryonic AV services or pilots that are happening, and have been dealing with those. And when dealing with those, have had to start thinking about adopting policies. Some others have been focused on trying to encourage AV services or pilots to occur within their borders because there is a perception that this will help with economic development and will communicate that this is a town that's in business and interested in encouraging this sort of initial service. And not every city is like that, but there are a few that are like that. And then in some cases, there are cities that are actually trying to address existing or expected transportation issues. On the top, you see is a photo of Chandler, Arizona, which is just, that's San Jose, and the bottom is Chandler. Okay, so the top is San Jose, and the bottom is Chandler. So the top is an example of the last bullet, and the bottom one is an example of the middle bullet. And so we'll discuss those for motivations number 2 and 3. So Chandler, a quote from Jane Smith, who's a former economic development innovation manager there, said, when you look at the companies that are involved in autonomous vehicles, look at the logos when they're put up on a list. I mean, I don't think any city wants to be left behind. And we heard this from multiple cities in terms of Las Vegas is another example of this, trying to get in on the ground floor of a trend and boosting the area as an example of a place where that can be done. Addressing existing transportation issues, an example of this is San Jose, which developed a request for information process to appraise potential AV deployment within the city, and hoping that deployment could start dealing with issues around traffic management and even land use issues. So this RFI includes pilot areas that would be made available to potential firms who'd be interested, potential use cases where how the AVs could be used, first and last mile services or shuttle services, and also data sharing opportunities, because the city of San Jose is also engaged with some of the smart infrastructure. Just to point out, like New York City, San Jose, in the California context, does not possess legal authority to manage AV testing, but it's still setting up a procedure for doing so. And again, like New York, in a different way, is influencing the practice of testing. But as far as we know, there isn't testing going on there right now. We spoke with Jill North, who's the Innovation Program Manager in San Jose, and she said, in our pilot, one of the things we are interested in is leveraging the autonomous vehicle, because it's traveling in a fixed route, to send a flag to our traffic management center when traffic time hits a certain threshold for our teams to go and clear the queue. So that's an example of how connectivity with both with signalized intersections and also connecting autonomous vehicles back into it, how autonomous vehicles could be possibly helpful in terms of managing traffic. Okay, so the policy areas that we're going to talk about here, and I'm going to be skipping over some quotes because I want to get done as close to 11:30 as possible, and we're already at 11:30. One of them is curb management. So it is thought that high adoption rates of autonomous vehicles could require converting curb parking to pick up and drop off zones. because of the fact that autonomous vehicles are probably going to have to operate in a way that enables them to pick up and drop off passengers by pulling up to the curb rather than doing any sort of double parking style of pickup or drop off. We already have examples of this happening in some cities for transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. And we have another example of something like this happening in Phoenix. We'll talk about this in a couple slides, but Valley Metro actually provided Waymo with information on all its available bus loading zones to assist with this issue, places to pick up and drop off for autonomous vehicles to safely pull in and pull out. In San Francisco, there's a lot of data available with information about how curbs are painted and therefore where there could be possible areas for conversion for pickup and drop-off zones, either for TNCs or for future autonomous vehicles. And this is an example of a curb that's painted for use by Uber in San Francisco. There's a quote from Robert Toniak here. I'm going to skip over the quotes because we're out of time. Smart infrastructure. Las Vegas is one of the cities that's begun investing in smart roads, for example, traffic signals that communicate with vehicles. And in the pilot period, they sent traffic light phasing to the AV shuttle, and they are also sending that information to the AV, the autonomous active lift consumer fleet, providing passenger trips on the strip, which you can actually take rides right now if you're fortunate enough to have to be assigned an autonomous vehicle by that fleet. There's not that many vehicles traveling on the strip. It's maybe about 40. The plan there is to begin in the Innovation District and to expand to other locations. This is that photo that you've already seen of the Innovation District area, and this is just a stock photo of infrastructure being installed. So that's another area, and we'll come back to that. Integration with public transit. Valley Metro in the Phoenix area partnered with Waymo to provide first and last mile transport for agency employees in a pilot that was meant to eventually extend to the agency's paratransit program, because Waymo autonomous vehicle rides were seen as being cheaper than paratransit rides. This is not the only example of this sort of thing being discussed. It's something that's also being discussed in the Boston area. Nutonomy has a partnership with some public agencies there, including the State Department of Transportation, I believe, to explore the possibility of autonomous provision of paratransit, which is a very expensive component of transit agency budgets. Note that Valley Metro did not decide which of the stations were which were and were not involved in the program. That was left up to Waymo in a negotiation process, which was what drew Waymo in to be willing to participate in this process. So that's an example with integration with public transit. First and last mile transport is one possibility. Shuttles are another possibility for these autonomous vehicles that are providing passenger services. Okay, another policy area: development, zoning, and parking, primarily parking. An example of this that's fairly notorious at this point is Chandler, which now allows developers to reduce off-street parking by 10% for each designated pickup or drop-off spot that they provide, up to 40% reduction in off-street parking. So the idea here, and this is something that apparently the last we checked, there wasn't an example yet of a developer that had taken this up. But it's an example of something that could take advantage of the possibility that autonomous vehicles could allow people to car shed. It's the idea, the hopeful idea, that autonomous vehicles, instead of increasing traffic, could actually decrease it if they're shared a lot and if it reduces people's auto ownership and enables the possibility for parking to be converted. So the image on the far upper right there is a parking structure in Chandler. There were some other interviewees in addition to Chandler who suggested tying a decrease in parking requirements to providing funds for an AV shuttle. So you could say, okay, fine, you don't have to provide off-street parking in as large an amount if you provide an AV shuttle. Some of our interviewees worried that their elected officials were ignoring this trend and continuing to expand parking facilities. Parking is a huge issue for municipalities. The funds, the finance, the percentage of municipal budgets that comes from parking revenues in some cities is quite large, and it's been declining due to the TNC trend, and would be expected to decline further with autonomous vehicles. Second to last, taxes and road user charges. The push towards road user charging is seen by some as both necessary and possible with the advent of autonomous vehicles, but it's also true that there's this prospect that we might have a large increase in traffic, and particularly with empty vehicles wandering around on streets, which also raises the perceived value of pricing. I have this comment in brackets just to note that the details of any road pricing scheme will strongly affect the success. And there's a lot of talk about pricing happening in San Francisco right now, for example. where there's going to be a vote whether in favor of whether or not to levy a new tax on all app-based ride-hailing services. This measure includes a component which is about autonomous vehicles. So they're prospectively suggesting that this would apply to autonomous vehicles as well. And finally, regional planning is our final policy area. And we're just going to note 3 examples. There's actually a 4th example, and there's some people from NIMTIC who may be here on the line. In the Boston region, MAPC created a coalition of 13 municipalities to jointly permit AV testing. The metropolitan area, the Maricopa area government's MPO in the Phoenix region is considering putting together a real-time roadway database to help AV firms to have accurate, up-to-date information to have their operations work properly. And MTC in the San Francisco Bay Area is conducting a lot of scenario planning, including AV impacts. I'll just mention that NIMTIC as well is interested in issues of infrastructure and whether or not infrastructure can be provided flexibly enough so that can be used for different purposes, including autonomous vehicles in the event that they do arrive. One challenge here is that MPOs do not advise, many MPOs do not advise on land use, and land use is potentially a big component of the impacts. Okay, so let's get to conclusions. And I'm gonna do a real quick 2 slides here. So nearly all public sector interviewees cited inadequate data sharing from AV firms, which mirrored the complaints that they have often had regarding app-based ride-hailing services. So this is something that's an ongoing issue for cities and for other agencies, local agencies and regional agencies. There are some policies that may provide benefits regardless of whether and how quickly AVs are adopted, such as parking reductions, but others may not have such benefits, and that includes smart infrastructure. And it's not clear, most of the firms, in fact, every one of the firms that we spoke with basically said, you know what, we're not betting on infrastructure. We're planning to have these vehicles work regardless of any particular infrastructure. And so it's not clear that cities are doing the right thing if they're spending a lot on that, absent the benefits that may exist without AVs. And then finally, we wanted to note that the lead up to planning time for autonomous vehicles is potentially just as long as any recent technological innovation. So it means that we have a lot of time to think this through, depending on how fast you think it's coming. This slide I'm skipping, and I have 3 takeaways for practice, and then we're going to end and take questions. Autonomous vehicles will very likely affect congestion, agency budgets, greenhouse gas emissions, and other local conditions. And so municipal agencies, local agencies definitely need to be involved, and they're the ones who are going to have to be involved in ways that can try to maximize the benefits and minimize the negative aspects of them. But they should also identify their underlying motivations for regulating autonomous vehicles before developing policies and plans rather than being only reactive. And we would argue they should implement transport and land use policy reforms that are valuable with or without the advent of autonomous vehicles. For example, parking reform and a more generalized form of road pricing that is not limited to autonomous vehicles or TNCs. And with that, we are done and we're ready for questions. But actually, I think we're going to hope that that we have a comment or 2 from Lindsay Mitchell. So I'm going to stop there and see if Jenny can tell me whether or not we've got Lindsay available.
Hi, Dan. This is
Laura.
Laura again. So thank you so much, Dan and Marcel. And I believe we do have Lindsay Mitchell with us. She is the strategic planning manager for the city of Arlington, which is one of the cities highlighted in this work. And I believe she should be unmuted. And so Lindsay, do you want to provide your thoughts, reaction, perspective on what was presented?
Sure. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciated the approach that Daniel and Marcel took to this because they are looking at things from a local government perspective and not so much the technical side, which I think there's plenty of research on technical aspects of AV and the advent of that. And I don't think there's much on the policy side. And so I think this was a valuable endeavor, and I learned a lot reading through the report about what other localities are doing and what their experiences have been. Arlington is a little bit different. We're one of the ones, I like the slide with the points on motivation. We're definitely one of the cities who was motivated from an economic development standpoint, for sure. We are also motivated from a transportation standpoint. If you all don't know, Arlington has long held the title of the largest city in the United States without public transportation, conventional public transportation. And so we've been out looking at new transportation innovation options that could help address our big need for public transportation, whether our citizens want to support and fund it in traditional ways or not. We still have a need for it. So we are looking at some of these things as a way to augment what we do have available, and so it's been valuable from that perspective. Our pilots were small, and but they were successful in that they taught us a lot about the state of the industry and kind of what's happening out there, and it was very valuable to participate in, and I appreciated being part of the selection of interviews here. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I believe we're going to keep you unmuted, Lindsay. So as we go to the Q&A portion, we're inviting those on the line to also pitch questions your way if they would like. So we do have a couple questions coming in, so I'll serve as moderator and throw these over to Dan and Marcel, as well as Lindsay. If you would like to make a comment on any of those, please do. So one of the first questions that were coming in was that the communication between vehicles and traffic lights and infrastructure and other vehicles was mentioned. And so if you could comment, Dan and Marcel, on what did you learn about what cities are thinking about in terms of how these vehicles will be communicating with other users of the road, pedestrians and cyclists?
Yeah, and I'm noticing some of these questions are relatively technical, and we can try to address them. But I want to point out that our kind of focus was kind of the municipal policy side of things. That said, safety didn't come up a ton in our interviews, and specifically pedestrian cyclist issues didn't come up nearly as much as well. What the literature is saying on this is that yes, this is definitely an issue, and there are ways in which the kind of the smart infrastructure that we're talking about neglects pedestrian and cyclists, or at least isn't focused on that issue. But I do think, there are different vehicles with different sorts of levels of communication. For example, one of the vehicles, the drive.ai vehicles, have a bit more information for people to interact with them in terms of a little kind of sign available on the vehicle itself for people to know where it's going and what it's doing. But this is something that our report doesn't have a ton to say about. So we can address it real briefly, and I'm gonna have Marcel say something, but I do wanna focus on what our report is mainly about, which is not so much the technical issues about how the vehicles will work, but about how and what cities are doing to respond.
Yeah, I would just add that in the technical side, there tends to be a bifurcation between vehicle-to-vehicle interactions, which is V2V, and vehicle-to-infrastructure. What was particularly interesting to us, and I think what's interesting to public sector employees, is that I think the San Jose case and the Las Vegas case indicate there's an opportunity for cities to leverage information they're receiving and not only giving out. So signal phasing is one, obviously, they're giving out. But both of these types of infrastructure allow cities to gain more real-time information. You can think about how Waze does this. It's like a crowdsourced way to think about traffic flow, accidents, and other types of roadway incidents. So I think that's something that cities seem interested in, and there's a way to leverage new vehicle technology for those monitoring, evaluation, and long-term planning issues. That jumped out to us.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marcel. So some of these questions that came in, they do have to do more with, I believe, the technical side, or not necessarily in the scope of the research. So talking about road safety and space consumption, at what level are we expecting to see some of those benefits? So I'm going to take moderator prerogative and potentially pass on this one for now. And then as well as, what are conflicts between AVs and non-AVs, and how is that being thought of? And maybe that is something you heard in your interviews. So Dan or Marcel, do you have, did that come up at all, of how cities are thinking about that?
This is definitely a big issue, but no, it didn't come up a lot. I mean, it's clear that the whole transition period is a huge one, and a lot of the modeling that's been going on and the estimates of the benefits that's been going on have taken that into account. And so there's a whole literature on that sort of issue, but it's not something that we focused on.
Okay. And then there was one other safety question. Again, I know you said safety didn't come up a lot, but would you be able to speak to any of this particular questions about certification mechanisms envisioned by the state or the national, state, or municipal level?
Yeah.
Did any of that come up that you could speak to?
It's a great question. I would just say the things that we would monitor, and if you're interested, that I would certainly monitor what happens at the federal level with the AV START Act. The primary provision of that act, if it's ever signed into law, is a vast expansion of the amount of federal motor vehicle safety standard exemptions. So that would rapidly increase the number of non-traditional vehicles. So at the federal level, that would increase testing to a significant degree, particularly in states that don't have state regulatory frameworks for that, which are still a number of states. The other thing I would look at is there's one of the things about this, we're talking about mixed traffic. We don't necessarily need to get to an autonomous vehicle to gain insights into how people are going to interact with these vehicles. And I'll point to Lindsay again. One thing we didn't mention, and it's in our report, but there's a ride-hailing company called Via. It operates also in New York and Chicago. Via is more like a shuttle-based service that's operating in Arlington on a subsidy basis. Via is starting to force some of their passengers, or encourage some of their passengers, to interact with the vehicle in what is effectively an autonomous way, where they're providing directions, they're providing pickup locations, how they could access or egress the vehicle. And so there's ways that we can glean insight into these kind of human vehicle interactions before we even get to that point. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Lindsay. There's a quote in our report about that as well.
Yes, and I sort of alluded to that in my comments, but yes, we do have our on-demand ride-sharing service that operates with regular gas-powered vehicles right now, but we do have a long-term vision to eventually have that be an autonomous fleet. Of course, that would be Via's decision as well, but that is the city's vision, and it is something that we're considering and working towards. So it's a thought process that we've started to engage in.
Laura?
Great. Yeah.
Is it okay if I dispatch a few questions?
Yeah, please do.
I can see them coming in, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of them. Some of them are technical questions and so on, and having to do with how AVs are expected to interact with each other and developments below level 4 and so on. So I'm referring to questions from Michael Glotz-Richter, and I think we don't have as much to say about those sorts of questions. I want to talk about some of the other questions that are coming up. But one question from Jake Friedman was, AV cars seem to have the potential to have a negative impact on transit operations and ridership. Is there talk at the potential of applying the same technology to fixed route transit? And the answer to that question, this came up a couple times when we talked to the firms. I think what's happening really in the market right now is the market, the race for the market is for the passenger market, not for the transit market. It's not seen as big of a market, and there doesn't seem to be very much interest in the firms that we spoke with in providing that sort of service, unless it involves a significant enough subsidy and is the sort of thing, for example, paratransit services. So it seems like there's a lot of potential there, but the market doesn't seem to be as large, and that's my impression about that. Mustafa Harb has a question: are companies and government agencies using these pilots to look at travel behavior changes? No, they're mainly using it to see if they can provide services and people will interact with these things appropriately and safely. There's a big focus on wanting to provide safe services, I think. I think Nathan Falk has an interesting and important question. He asks, in your research, did cities have a proposed solution for how they think AV companies should solve for zombie miles when vehicles are not on trips? And this is a big controversy. There are a lot of cities that think that they should be double charged if they're empty. My own opinion on this, any sort of transportation economist's opinion on this would be, you just charge for road use, and if it's empty or not, it's still having the same impact on traffic. That is to say, it's occupying space, it's causing congestion, and if there's people in the car, they share the cost of that congestion fee. If there's no one in the car, then the firm has to pay it, and that gives them an incentive not to do too much of that thing. So that's one point I wanted to make there.
I would just add on the zombie miles is a great question. Another piece of that is road pricing is only one component of what may or may not influence zombie miles. And zombie miles are when these vehicles are operating without a passenger. What's another important point that came up in a conversation is that parking pricing makes a large difference on zombie miles. So a fear that was floated by one of our interviewees is if parking if parking is priced to the adequate degree and the roads are not, then that further encourages the zombie mile congestion, as opposed to the differential being in the opposite direction where parking is cheaper. So these things are not operating in isolation, and I think that's why why the pickup and drop off zone is important, and there's a movement towards parking minimums. Fleets are going to be, if fleets are competing in an AV fashion, ride hailing fashion, there's going to be attempts to make the most efficient price-wise use of the road space. So the pricing from parking the road is going to have to be connected, and I don't want to disaggregate that.
Okay, so keeping on going here, there's a question about how cities differ from other cities which are more skeptical. I think the reason that some cities are planning for these is because they have testing going on either in their city or very nearby. And that's one of the main reasons. And there are ones that are hoping for, some kind of economic development aspect of things. So I think those are two answers why you have some cities that are involved and some cities that aren't. And frankly, if a city doesn't have testing happening anywhere nearby, it's not clear that they should be doing much planning for these things. There's every reason to believe that the estimates of the imminent arrival of autonomous vehicles are not the case. The Economist just ran an article this week, including a quote from a person who used to work for Alphabet and Waymo, and who says that they think that the advent of autonomous vehicles in any significant number is 30 to 50 years away. So that may be the case. That's one of the reasons why I think we need to think about this as something that involves being flexible and adopting policies that work with or without autonomous vehicles. Okay, and there was a private question about the curb space. Someone asked a question about what's going to happen to curb space. Is curb space going to be all privatized? Should it remain public? I think this is a really big issue. Equity is a huge issue, and access is a huge issue. And this is the curb is going to be a real public asset because it's going to be competed over for all these services. I think it's an open question, but there should be some pricing for private use of the curb. And we haven't, seen much about that yet, but it should definitely be something that we considered, and that should be in the densest urban areas should be pricing the curb for use by private entities. And there is some discussion of that already. So Sophia has a question. You mentioned that testing is happening on fixed routes in San Jose and Innovation District in Boston, and there's some other places. So anything about the streets, areas that where testing is happening? In general, Boston is a good example. They were relatively unpopulated areas that were first chosen, and they were areas that also the firms thought they could find them relatively manageable. It's one of the reasons why you have firms testing in places like Phoenix in the first place, is because the road conditions and the weather conditions are such that things aren't too difficult. And Marcel might want to say something.
Yeah, I would just say to Sophia's question on the shuttle side, the Las Vegas case, not San Jose, but the Las Vegas case, that was a downtown circulator. And so that was in a fairly busy part of Las Vegas. And actually, the city in this partnership not only removed traffic from one side of that road, so it changed the existing traffic situation. It also changed the signaling so that it connected directly to that. We're also seeing another of what we would call closed course shuttles. So these are like the shuttle in Arlington that's operating on the large sports campus. There's some AV shuttles that have operated on airports, some college campuses. So the shuttle seem to be operating in more controlled environments, as opposed to the private AV fleets, which have more free reign, in part because they're not legally constrained.
Lindsay, do you want to say anything about this in terms of what's going on in Arlington with respect to VIA's pilot services? Because that's interesting. I know VIA isn't actually running them autonomously yet, but did you want to speak?
Right. Yeah, they did a kind of a small scale pilot that looked not at true AV functionality, but how the customer interacts with an autonomous vehicle, to sort of prep them for the customer service side of managing an on-demand ride-sharing service that could be autonomous. And I don't actually know yet what their results were of that field testing that they did here. We're still waiting on that, but I will be interested to find out.
Okay, great. One other question was from Pooja Gangurde. How are these cities communicating to citizens about AV technology pilots and community preparedness? And that's an interesting question. And we didn't hear a ton about communication about these services. I'm going to see if Marcel has anything to say about this.
Yeah, one thing I would mention is that Cambridge, Massachusetts hosted a public forum, an open-ended public forum to get input from their citizens on what they would want AVs for, also to give information on possible pilots. So that's one just very direct way to do that.
Okay, and let me see what else I'm missing here so far. We're kind of knocking these out because we got 4 minutes left. There's a question about what the role of state DOTs ought to be. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think these questions that we're looking at have been primarily about the municipal role. And the state DOTs have been, in California, they're a little bit out of the loop because it's the CPUC has been more involved and the DMV that's been involved, but not really the DOT quite so much. I mean, the sorts of services that are envisioned being offered aren't so much intercity services as they are intracity services. They are talking about these, the model that almost all firms are talking about, Tesla is an exception, is a shared fleet model. And the shared fleet model relies on a certain density of destinations and origins and density of customer traffic. And that's an urban model. So, I don't know whether or not, I mean, there are all sorts of AV firms out there. And some of them are talking about the value of AVs in sort of a more rural and hinterland context. But the main kind of business model seems to be something like what the TNCs are doing now. And the TNC model is primarily an urban model. It's one that works and is cost effective in places where you can get enough density. Virginia Lingham is asking if the interview framework is available in the report, and yes, it is. So the report, you can click on the link that Laura provided a few minutes ago. And I just want to see if I'm missing any questions. Oh, here's a question from Francis Wu. In your opinion, what was the biggest barrier for local agencies developing policies? I mean, I guess the premise of the question is that local agencies ought to develop policies. And frankly, I'm not sure if local agencies ought to be developing policies. They ought to be developing them if there's a really strong prospect of autonomous vehicles operating on their streets in the near future. And so if you're in Los Angeles, if you're in Florida, if you're in Arizona, these are all places that we're hearing about impending services happening. You need to be ready. If you're in a cold weather state, Boston is the only place that we've found that actually has any services being tested, and they're not really doing frankly, not doing a lot of testing. They only had a relatively few number of vehicles, and the testing was going on elsewhere from the firm. So, the barrier is, well, why should we do this if we have so many other things to do? Municipal agencies have got their hands full of all kinds of planning, and this isn't always going to rise to the level of the most important thing. I will address this question regarding whether or not we need to ban non-AVs to exploit the efficiency gains. I'm really reluctant to think about or promote the idea of an imminent ban in any place on non-autonomous vehicles for all kinds of reasons, perhaps mainly for equity ones. But I think I think it's a political non-starter in the U.S. context for the most part. And the one exception to that might be in places where whole neighborhoods are being developed out of whole cloth, so-called smart city projects that are being done by companies like Alphabet and Amazon even. In those places, you can imagine perhaps there could be a ban on only autonomous vehicles being used, particularly if autonomous vehicles are being used in a context of high occupancy use and relatively low traffic. I think there's lots of benefits there for pedestrians and cyclists. But outside of that context, you can imagine a kind of a dystopian future where autonomous vehicles are the only things that can run on streets, and you can't ride your bike unless your bike is outfitted with an RFID tag so you can be recognized by an autonomous vehicle. So, and we do hear about that. Some of the modeling that's being done is that sort of modeling, and it's a little bit unrealistic in my view. So so I think we're at 11 o'clock. I mean, sorry, we're at noon Pacific time, and so thanks everyone for signing on and listening, and we welcome any follow-up questions you may have via email. You can get the report in the policy brief. And Laura, do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dan and Marcel. We'll just close out here really quickly. I also want to give a special thanks to Lindsay Mitchell for joining us with the
Thanks,
City
Lindsay.
of Arlington. I am going to send this quick in the chat box, a link. If you take a couple minutes and provide us your feedback on the webinar, I'd really appreciate that. And everyone will be getting an email follow-up that will include links where you could download today's slides, view and watch the webinar recording, and also access the reports and policy brief. So with that, we want to thank everyone for attending today, and this concludes our webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.